pitfalls and progress, research to move towards safe and sustainable sanitation for all, which will be presented by Professor Michael Templeton, who is a chartered civil engineer and professor of public health engineering in the Department of Civil Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering at Imperial College London. His research focuses on addressing public health challenges related to water supply and sanitation. And to date, he has collaborated on studies with partners in countries including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Sierra Leone, Nepal, and India. He's a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers in the UK, and he has served on expert advisory panel for a number of organizations, including the World Health Organization, the Ethiopian Federal Ministry of Health, the UK's Global Challenge Research Fund, and the Swedish Research Council. Our moderator today is Dr. Fessel Ejigu from Norway. Usually our moderators are from Ethiopia, but because of his interest and our current collaborations, so we have identified Dr. Fessel Ejigu, who is the Associate Professor of Water and Environmental Engineering at the Arctic University of Norway. He holds his MSc and PhD from the Faculty of Science and Technology, Norwegian University of Life Sciences in Water and Environmental Engineering. Dr. Fessel has multidisciplinary academic background and specialization in the health risk assessment and management practices for different water systems, such as drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and recreational water. He has experience as a research scientist at the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research. He is also involved in the Water Quality Tools Project, the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, and also in the project called Pollution Risk Analysis in NIBIO. So the presentation time is about 45 minutes, plus or minus, which will be followed by comments or questions by audience. So I will now give the virtual floor to Dr. Fessel to moderate or to chair this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Felleke. Can you hear me clear?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us today in this webinar. I have a very good, great feeling for moderating this webinar and using your time. I'm sure it is gonna be useful and more informative webinar for all of us. Before I start this session, I do want to acknowledge this webinar events for all of us, which is established in a wake of COVID-19 pandemic. In line with this, I would like to quickly say, I hope each of you is safe, healthy, and doing okay wherever joining us from. Our schedule is as it is mentioned. It's the main speaker will present his presentation for 45 minutes and followed by a discussion in the form of question and answer or in the comment. Now I will give the floor for the speaker, Professor Michael Templeton. As Dr. Felleke mentioned, he's a professor of public health engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Imperial College in the Imperial College of London. Today, his topic is a pitfall and progress, a research to move toward the safe and sustainable sanitation for all. Professor Michael, The virtual floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fessel. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, of course.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you to Professor Felike also for inviting me to speak. I'm speaking to you today from London in the UK, and I wish I could be in Addis with you. It's a great city to visit, a place I've been to many times, and I've actually been collaborating with Addis Ababa University since 2017. So it's great to see a lot of familiar names in the audience, and I hope everyone is well. I'll speak for maximum 45 minutes. It's a fairly high-level presentation, so I'm going to be not too technical, and I hope that there's something in the presentation for everybody. I'm going to be talking about really a series of different projects related to sanitation that have been going on for the past 10 years in various countries around the world. And my title today is Pitfalls and Progress. So those of you who work in sanitation know that one of the most common types of toilets in the world are pit latrines. So it's a bit of a joke, the title. And the subtitle is Research to Move Towards Safe and Sustainable Sanitation for All. And this is a reference to the Sustainable Development Goals and how the current goal is that there should be universal access to safely managed sanitation for everybody in the world by 2030. And it seems that that is quite a huge challenge. And you might ask, well, why haven't we already got there? And what do we need to understand in order to get there? And so I'm going to present some research from the standpoint of an engineer in terms of what I think are some of the questions that need to be answered to get to that goal. So those are my contact details on the first slide. So if anyone wants to contact me after the presentation, please do send me an email. And the webpage has further information about the projects that I'll be giving you snapshots about today. I'll try and keep it to under 45 minutes. I realize it's the middle of the afternoon in Ethiopia, so if you do drift off, or if you lose touch with what I'm saying, a lot of the main points that I'll be talking about in the presentation are summarized in this editorial article which I've published, which summarizes again the key points I'll be making today. So if you're interested, or if you missed something, it's only a sort of 3-page paper, and you might want to check that out to find out a bit more information. I like to give my take-home messages up front also, and again, in case you have to go somewhere partway through the meeting. And I think probably one of the main things I'd want to stick in your mind, if you don't remember anything else from the presentation, is this image of 2 school buses. For some reason, North Americans always use school buses to help to visualize quantities of people. But if you look at the current statistics, and it's it's very variable around the world, but approximately about 1 to 2 school buses full of children under the age of 5 years old will die during the next hour because they don't have access to water, sanitation, or hygiene. So that's quite a shocking statistic. And if 2 real school buses drove off a cliff into the ocean with children in them, that would be global news. Every news agency in the world would be covering that. But because this happens every day around the world, it's not something that always makes the news. But I think whatever area of research you're in, you should be strongly motivated for some reason. And I can't think of a higher motivation really than this sad statistic. So some caveats from the start in terms of what I'll be presenting. So I'm an engineer, so I'm presenting this from an engineer's perspective, but sanitation is not just an engineering problem. Many would argue it's not even primarily an engineering problem. So I acknowledge there are also social, behavioral, educational, economic aspects to this. And really, one of the key messages of my presentation is that to get to the Sustainable Development Goal for sanitation and to overcome the challenges, we need to have multidisciplinary interventions. So every discipline brings something different to this challenge. And a lot of the research that I'm involved in is working alongside public health people, behavioral scientists, So people who understand things that I don't understand as an engineer. But conversely, engineers I think do have a big role to play. And in the presentation today, hopefully you'll see some of the technical challenges that I think engineers can contribute to. So I've shown at the bottom of the slide there the Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 6 is circled. And the other thing I might say is that quite often people think about sanitation as having benefits for health, but it has lots of other benefits also. And so, for example, I'm going to present data later looking at the impact of water and sanitation in schools and how that might impact on not only on child health, but also on quality of education and issues like gender equality also. So something else for all the engineers and scientists in the audience to remember is that even if you're working on a particularly narrowly defined technical challenge, it's likely that it's having lots of broader benefits which benefit other SDGs, not just the SDG 6 for water and sanitation. So when I say the word sanitation, different people might have different understandings of what I mean by sanitation. Sometimes people think of hand washing or sort of general cleanliness when they hear the word sanitation. In terms of the international development circles and what the United Nations and the World Health Organization mean by sanitation, they mean really a toilet. So some way to contain the human waste that people produce, and to make sure that it doesn't come in contact with other people and spread disease. And the most common toilet in the world is probably one that looks like the one shown on the screen here. So a very large percentage of the world's population are not connected to sewers, so the waste remains on site. And probably the simplest and most affordable type of toilet would be a pit latrine. So basically a pit dug maybe 3 or 4 meters deep, lined to prevent collapse, and then a superstructure over top of it. And you could ask, is that really a safe and sustainable form of sanitation? And I apologize if you've had lunch and this is a bit of an unappetizing slide. I should have warned you maybe, but one of the reasons you could argue pit latrines are not safe and sustainable is because they have to be emptied eventually. And especially if you're in a very dense urban area, you don't always have the luxury to just dig another pit. You have to do something, you have to empty the pit. And unfortunately, this job falls to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world, normally in the lowest classes of society, who have to do this very demeaning and very risky job from a health standpoint, often without any kind of protective equipment. And quite often there's no place even to dispose of the waste once it's emptied from the toilet. So it ends up back into the environment somehow, in a drain or into a river, which really overcomes all of the benefits of having a toilet in the first place in terms of containing the waste. So while pit latrines did meet the definition of improved sanitation in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, which were set in 2000, you could argue that in some situations, they don't necessarily meet the definition of sustainable sanitation when we think about Sustainable Development Goals, if there isn't a plan for how you empty that waste and dispose of the waste in a safe way. So one of the challenges is, how do we come up with a more sustainable toilet? So something that costs about the same as a pit latrine is about as equally easy to construct, but is more sustainable, so it lasts longer. It's not going to fill up as quickly. And I was part of a project. I was lucky enough to be part of a project which was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we looked at whether you could incorporate worm composting into the pit latrine, so into the toilet. So slightly adapt the design of the latrine, but using very affordable methods, so that you could maintain a worm population which would degrade the waste on site. And we call this Tiger Toilets, was the brand that we came up with for marketing it. And we called it Tiger Toilets because we use tiger worms, which are shown in the slide there, which are not just found in the UK, they're found all over the world, really, tiger worms. They're the most common type of earthworm in the world. And they're called tiger worms because they have stripes on them. So you've probably seen tiger worms before. And whenever you come up with a good idea, you need to first do some lab experiments to see if it will work. And so the diagram on the right, don't worry about it too much, but it was our experimental setup. And basically we had prototypes of latrines without the worms in them. And then we had comparison ones with the worm populations. And we were able to vary things like how many worms do you need, what's, for the rate at which the waste was being introduced, what types of drainage layers are best, should it be a wet toilet or a dry toilet. And we did some very rigorous science to try to figure out what's the best way to design these on-site worm-based sanitation methods. And if you're interested, since then, this approach has been taken up by a number of organizations around the world, and there are now Tiger toilets in at least 11 countries that we know of, and I think over 200,000 households at least who are using them around the world, mostly in India, but also in other countries. And we've recently formed an association called the International Worm-Based Sanitation Association. So that's what the web link is on the slide there, if you'd like to find out more about that. And so after we did some lab experiments, we did some pilot scale experiments, and these were still done in the UK at this point, where we were able to do it sort of at scale of what a typical household would produce. And this is some very crude prototype data. So I sent an undergraduate student of ours out to this test site in Wales in the UK. And you can see that this is a very basic slide. There's two curves. One is the blue curve, which was toilets on site that had the worm population optimized in it. And the red curve is the equivalent toilet without the worm population. And our undergraduate summer projects typically last for 3 months. So you can see the timeline on the x-axis is 90 days. And basically the student was measuring feces, masses of feces accumulation over time, over the course of this summer project. And you can see that the fill rate was reduced by between 1/2 and 2/3 over the course of this 3-month project. So again, this was still very much at the beginning, and we just wanted to see whether in theory this would work. And it was encouraging because we saw that the worms were degrading the waste. And then the worms, actually, they also consumed dead worms also. And so they're converting a lot of that mass and metabolizing it and expending it, using it up as energy as they move around in the toilet. So the next stage was to go to the real world. And so for this, we had partners in India. And a big part of it, which ran alongside the lab experiments, was to talk to people who need toilets, find out what they wanted in the toilet, what they didn't want. And for them, actually, smell was quite a big thing. They wanted a toilet which didn't smell. But also they recognized that, having worms in there would mean that it wouldn't fill up as quickly. One of the reasons we chose India to start the research was that there was already a culture there of using worms for composting other types of waste, like livestock waste or crop waste. And so it sort of made sense to people that this was a good idea. And so here's a picture of what they look like. It really looks like a pit latrine, a normal pit latrine from the outside. But if you then take the lid off of the container where the waste is going, that's where the worm reactions are happening with the waste. And so this provided a great opportunity for researchers to go out to India, because we knew when all of these toilets were installed, and we had information about how many people were using the toilets. And so we could go out over the next few years and see, well, how quickly are they filling up? Are the worm populations still healthy? Are they still there? Have the worms just left the toilet, or are they still in the toilet? And also do some other measurements, for example, looking at the liquid fraction of the waste and the quality of that. And so, students from Imperial College tend to be very mathematical. And one of my students, she went out there and took the lid off of a number of these toilets and measured with a laser measure down to the level of the waste at different parts in the toilet. And it wasn't always flat because of the way that the waste was introduced from the toilet. So had to do sort of a complicated calculation of what was the actual mass that was accumulating in these toilets. And another student went out and installed infrared cameras into a number of toilets with the household's consent. And this was not in the toilet itself, but in the part where the waste was being discharged, so where the worms were. And I won't show the video here, but basically it was really fascinating because some of these toilets were running after 4 or 5 years without having added new worms. It was just the same worm population from the beginning. And sometimes the waste would come in and the worms would completely degrade the waste, the newly introduced waste within an hour, sometimes very quickly. And so one of the benefits of these toilets, which we didn't anticipate, was that because the waste doesn't stay there long before the worms consume it, is that the smells are actually are much reduced in this type of toilet compared to a pit latrine. So, as engineers, we approached it and said, oh, great, this will reduce the fill rate. But social scientists told us, actually, that's great, but they really also want it to be a less smelly toilet, which is important to them. And it ended up achieving that goal also. So that's the Tiger toilet. And it's maybe something that, I think it has applications in a number of countries around the world, and certainly probably in rural parts of Ethiopia, it might be very applicable also. Another problem with pits is that, so I mentioned that they fill up. Another problem with pits is that they leach contaminants into the ground. So the whole idea of a pit latrine is that the liquid fraction of the waste, the urine or the water, should actually leave the pit. It should go into the soil, because otherwise the pit just fills up with liquid very quickly. So that's great if your groundwater level is very low, because there would be a low risk of contamination. But it's not so great if your water level, your water table for your groundwater is quite high, which unfortunately is quite often the case in a lot of slum areas around the world. So a lot of slums are built on land which is considered not very suitable or not very ideal. Quite often they're prone to flooding, and quite often they have high water tables, especially near coastal regions, for example. And so in this project, I'm moving on to a different research project now. Here we were looking at nitrate. So whether the nitrogen that is in our feces and in our urine, which is normally found as ammonia or organic nitrogen, whether that transforms into nitrate and whether that nitrate reaches groundwater eventually. Because that's potentially a big problem if you're putting toilets in everywhere to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, but you're polluting groundwater at the same time. So you might be making progress towards the sanitation goal, but harming the drinking water access goal at the same time. So we did some modeling, fairly basic sort of advection dispersion based modeling if you're a groundwater modeling person. And we were able to do some calculations using some field data also to calculate what would be the nitrate concentrations over time at different depths below the bottom of the toilet, and how long would it take for the nitrate to build up in an aquifer to a level that would be not safe from a drinking water standpoint. So there's a WHO limit of 50 milligrams per liter for nitrate. And so we were able to build this model and play with some of the variables, because it's quite a complicated problem actually, because one of the variables is whether actually the nitrate is formed in the soil or not. Which depends on the conditions in the soil and whether that you have the bacteria present that nitrify the waste. But one of the take-home messages from the presentation, from the project, was that actually how you manage your sanitation and where you put your toilets actually matters hugely in terms of the subsequent risk to drinking water quality. And so this was actually a project in Nepal. And we looked at 3 different slum communities which had different types of wells which they were using for drinking water. Some were shallow, some were quite deep. And we also collected information about the types of toilets and how those toilets were being maintained and how frequently they're being emptied. And we found some correlations between how people design and maintain their pit latrines and the contamination of the water. So we measured the nitrate concentration in the surrounding water types. Wells. And so there definitely is a clear link there. And we thought that this was an important thing to research because there's already a lot of good information and advice about how to locate toilets near wells from a microbial standpoint to prevent microbial contamination. But there was less information about what the guidelines should be for preventing chemical contamination. And in some ways, you could argue that chemical contamination is maybe even more important or trickier challenge, because if you get bacteria in your water, that's a bad thing, but you can kill bacteria quite easily with chlorine. You can disinfect the water. Nitrate, once it's in water, is a bit more of a complicated contaminant to get out of the water. So I think there should be an even higher motivation to prevent groundwater pollution by nitrate in the first place, by understanding how to properly install sanitation facilities. So the next area of research is more about what's in the latrines and what do we do with it once the latrine is full. And so there's a lot of really clever researchers around the world who have come up with lots of ways of doing manual emptying of latrines using fairly simple technologies, like the one shown on the left there, which is called the Gulper, which was created by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is sort of a human-powered pump, basically, to pump waste out of a latrine. And in an ideal world, I guess you'd have something like what's shown on the bottom right there, which is a vacuum tanker truck, which you'd be able to just put a hose down the latrine and it would suck out the waste. Quite often, though, you don't have enough room in slums to be able to. Your roads aren't wide enough to get a vehicle like that into it, or you might not have access to the latrine in the household. So there is a need for clever ideas for smaller scale technologies that people can empty toilets with. But the other issue is, even if we have a technology to empty the toilets, what do we do with the waste once we've emptied it? As I said earlier, quite often, if you don't have a solution for that, the waste ends up being just introduced back into the environment again. And so one of the emerging trends in sanitation around the world is to think of sanitation not as just a technology, but actually as a service. And the whole idea here is to think of what's called the fecal sludge management chain. So not just think about giving people a toilet, but think about the long term of, well, what's going to happen with the waste over time, and can we do something beneficial with the waste? And so service models are popping up around the world, and they are quite often based on container-based toilets. So instead of building a fixed latrine in the ground, you would get a toilet which has a container, which somebody from the business would come by and take on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, similar to rubbish collection, I guess. And then the business actually does all the collection, transport, treatment, and transformation of the waste into some kind of valuable product. It might be a fertilizer product, like a biosolid product for agricultural use, or it might be to transform the waste into energy, for example, through digestion of the waste. And so I think this is an emerging trend. I think there's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement over the potential value that you can get out of the waste from toilets, and I think a lot of the models so far have shown that to fully finance this business model, you quite often do need subsidies either from donors or from government to make the whole business model work. But I think it's still a model that's evolving, and it's being applied in different countries around the world. And I'm really interested in, do they work everywhere? Why do they work in some places? Why not in other places? And we did some research recently, which put together a framework for people to use when they're going to a new city and deciding, would container-based sanitation be a good business model, a good service model to apply in that new city? And so one of the potential values that you could get from the waste is to recover biogas. And so many of you are probably familiar with this. This is what a lot of big cities do with sewage sludge waste, is they digest it and generate biogas. potentially you could do that on smaller scales also. And this table shows the biogas yields that you can get from different types of waste. And you can see human excrement is there. So about 0.04 cubic meters per person per day. And so especially I'd say over the past sort of 30 years, there's been a huge growth in the application of biogas technologies, smaller scale biogas technologies. And so the graph on the left there shows the number of biogas plants globally. I should say most of them were in China and India, but that's the total number. And quite often these smaller scale biogas digesters are producing biogas to be used for cooking. So to hook up to household biogas stoves, which then replaces dirtier types of fuels. So you're not only treating human waste and having a public health benefit in that way, you're also having a public health benefit by improving air quality in homes, by allowing people to use cleaner fuels for cooking in their homes. So that sounds like a great idea, but a lot of research has gone into this over the years, and people have found that biogas systems do break down and don't always work out. So there are a lot of advantages to biogas systems: improved sanitation, lower cost energy source. Depending on how you're doing the digestion, you can also produce the low cost fertilizer. So there's lots of great benefits. But practically speaking, people have also found that they don't always work out. They're not what I would call an install and walk away technology. There is some maintenance and operation that's required. Also, there's been research to show that they don't always work in cold regions or in particularly arid regions as well. So I guess my message from this is that quite often there's a lot of hype, or there's a lot of expectation around recovery of resources from waste, and you have to recognize that they might be more suitable in some locations than others, and nothing is free. There's always challenges that have to be overcome with a lot of these resource recovery technologies. Another method which we're doing some research on currently is a method called pyrolysis for treating the waste. So pyrolysis is a much smaller space footprint, a much quicker process than digestion. So digestion tends to take several hours to produce biogas. Pyrolysis is a much quicker process where you heat up the waste to several hundred degrees in the absence of oxygen. So it's not incineration. We're not burning the waste. You're increasing the temperature in an inert environment, and that actually causes chemical degradation of the organic molecules in the waste. And as a result of pyrolysis, you produce a number of different products. So not just gas, but you also produce oil, bio-oil, and you also produce biochar. And you can actually adapt the process depending on what the product is that you want to produce. So if you're in an agricultural area, a rural area, biochar might be good to produce because it can be used as a soil amendment to help crop growth and to improve soil quality. If you're in a more urban area, maybe biochar is not very interesting to you, but maybe you'd be interested in recovering the biogas and the bio-oil from the waste. So you can adjust the pyrolysis conditions to produce that. And so the picture there on the bottom is an example of the type of biochar that's produced from this pyrolysis process. And we did some research where we thought about the entire fecal sludge management chain and also what kind of pre-treatment you might have to do before pyrolysis in order to make it an energy sensible thing to do in terms of, hopefully actually recovering energy, you're producing energy as opposed to just spending energy by treating the waste. And if you can dry the sludge basically in an energy efficient way, for example, using solar drying, we found that if you can get the water content down to below about 55% by weight, you actually do end up through pyrolysis being able to be in a sensible position to be producing energy from the waste. And actually, you could argue that pit latrine sludge is actually better than sewage sludge for this purpose because the water content is lower. It depends on the type of toilet that you have, but especially if you have dry latrines, the water content is going to be a lot lower. Okay, my last few slides are going back to health again, which is what I started off the lecture by talking about. And you know, quite often there's this assumption that if we put toilets in, that's going to stop disease. A lot of fairly high-profile recent studies have showed that actually sanitation on its own does not always prevent disease, and there are lots of different pathways for diseases to spread. Some of the research we've been doing with colleagues at Addis Ababa University has been focusing on one particular type of disease, which is called schistosomiasis, or you might have heard it called bilharzia before, or other names. I'll call it schisto for short, just because it's a long name to call it. And we were interested in whether improving access to water and sanitation would help to prevent schistosomiasis. And so schistosomiasis is a disease that's spread not through drinking contaminated water, but through water contact. It's quite prevalent in parts of Ethiopia and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's spread from an infected person into water, and snails get infected. And then the snails shed a parasite, which ends up infecting another person when they come in contact with water that has the parasite in it. So if you're bathing or doing laundry or doing fishing, and your arms and your legs or other parts of your body are exposed to the water, you're very likely to get schistosomiasis. And so we were interested in whether, if we put sanitation into schools or communities, whether that would break this transmission cycle. So if infected people were not able to transmit their feces or urine that has the eggs in it for these worms, whether that would prevent infection. And we worked with this is why it's really important to do multidisciplinary studies, but we worked with biologists who told us that this disease is really efficient and it's been around for thousands of years. And the reason why it's been around for so long is because it only takes one of these eggs hatching in water to infect a snail. And that then produces 20,000 of the parasites, which can infect people. And in theory, if you get, well, 2 of these into your skin, in theory, you could develop schistosomiasis. So it's a very efficient disease in terms of keeping itself going through this intermediate snail host in the environment. So if you think about it from an engineering or a mathematics standpoint, you would need to have almost 100% coverage of sanitation. So everybody in the community using toilets 100% of the time in order to stop all of the eggs from going into the water and thereby reducing the parasite numbers in the water. If you had, let's say, 20% coverage or 30% of people who had toilets, it's really unlikely from a mathematical standpoint that you would actually reduce the disease in a measurable kind of way. So that's what we were trying to demonstrate and to figure out was what level of sanitation coverage would you need to actually have an impact on this disease. So the first thing we did was what's called a systematic review. And these are really common in medical research, maybe less common in engineering research. But the idea of a systematic review is you read the hundreds of papers that people have done before on the subject. And normally each study is maybe a case study from one particular village or one particular country. And the idea of a systematic review is you combine all of the data from those studies into one huge data set. And so by having a much bigger data set, you can come up with much more powerful, statistically strong conclusions, which is what's called a meta-analysis. So that's what we did for, we looked at all the papers studying sanitation and schistosomiasis, and also water and schistosomiasis. And some of these studies, as you can see in the diagram, looked only at children in schools. Some of them looked at children and adults. Some of them only looked at adults. And we combined those together. And the overall message was that really sanitation did have an effect. It wasn't a huge effect, but it did have an effect. But that most of the studies had some problems with them. So what we would call socioeconomic confounding. So in other words, they might have compared people with toilets and without toilets, but the people with toilets might have had lots of other reasons why they weren't infected. And for example, maybe they were in professions that didn't have any contact with water, whereas the poorer people were fishermen or farmers who did have regular contact with water. And the other thing was that a lot of these previous studies were done by medics and they didn't involve engineers. And so their description of the sanitation or of the toilets was incomplete. And it was hard to tell from the research what type of toilet it was, whether people were actually using the toilet, how old they were, whether they were already full, for example. And so we decided we should do some original research to look into this in further detail. And so we were really fortunate to partner with the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, EPHI, and other partners, other research partners, who were going around to, it was about 1,600 schools across Ethiopia. So it was about 80,000 school children, so 50 children per school, 80,000 school children in Ethiopia. And the medical colleagues from EPHI were measuring, taking samples to measure various types of worm infections, not just schistosomiasis, but also other types of helminth infections. And they were also measuring things like stunting and anemia and other impacts of being exposed to these worms over time. And our role on the engineering side was to go into the schools of all of these kids and to look at what was the quality of the water and sanitation and hygiene in those schools. And so we had to come up with a way of scoring the sanitation, for example. And so one of the things we did is we developed this scoring system where we looked at, do the boys and girls share the latrines? If they don't share the latrines, some questions about, for example, are there doors on the latrines? How clean are the latrines? Are there flies and odors? So very quantifiable, objective questions that our surveyors went around and collected data about. And what that allowed us to do is to come up with a way of quantifying sanitation quality, which we could then compare with the health data using statistical methods. And interestingly, when we did this, we found that actually sanitation was not really linked to schistosomiasis very well, which is sort of what we expected from the beginning as I was explaining the life cycle. But we did find that there were links to other types of worms, like hookworm, for example. And so that was based on a huge national mapping program in 2013-14 in Ethiopia. And as I said, it does sort of make sense based on our understanding of the life cycles of these worms. But it was still an important study to do, I think, to inform public health policy in terms of how we should be improving schools to reduce the risk of these types of infections. And we did actually find a link between schistosomiasis and collection of water from nearby rivers, for example. So there was a clear risk relationship there. So if you're interested in learning more about this research and also other research that's been going on looking at how to treat the water, for example, to remove these parasites, there's our webpage there, wiserschisto.com. And Professor Feleke from Addis Ababa University is part of that project, as well as his research group members. So that's just about the end of my presentation. I think it's almost been 40 minutes or so. So the take-home messages, the first thing I'd say is if you're talking to people who are social scientists or public health people, and they say there's no role for engineers in sanitation, we already know all the technical answers. It's just about money or training people. I would disagree with that. I think scientists and engineers do have important roles to play alongside the other disciplines to achieve sanitation for all. Basic pit latrines are better than having nothing, but they will eventually fill up and they can contaminate groundwater. So those are things which are not said enough and need to be considered carefully by engineers when they install latrines. Always think about the end user and involve them in the sanitation selection. So, going back to the tiger toilet example, we spent a lot of time talking to people to figure out how that should shape the design of the toilet, because there's no point coming up with a clever toilet that nobody wants to use or nobody can afford to use, obviously. So definitely work with the people who are going to use your sanitation solutions. Contain the waste now, but don't forget its long-term fate. So where will it end up eventually? Is it really waste? or could you actually recover value from that waste? And are there sort of sustainable business models for doing that? And finally, in terms of health, sanitation is probably only a piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole solution. And it also depends heavily on the type of disease. So whether you're talking about fecal oral like diseases, or things like cholera, or if you're talking about something like schistosomiasis, very different transmission cycles. And so the levels of sanitation coverage and usage are probably key determinants of its impact, as well as the type of disease. So, as I said earlier, do you need 90% of people in the community to have toilets, or is 50% enough? What level is needed before you actually get to health benefits from sanitation? And so just to finish off again with this image, which hopefully will stay in your minds and motivate you to do something in this field of study. If you're interested in more information, so these are the acknowledgements and credits of the various people who worked on these projects. I'm happy for the slides to be distributed, but there's links to the various papers which provide more information about these projects. So that's all I have, Dr. Fessel. I hope that was interesting.
Yes, thank you, Professor Michael, for your nice and interesting presentations, and you highlighted the very relevant information and like the importance of multidisciplinary intervention strategy to address these sustainable development goals, about the PET toilets, the importance of participatory interventions involving the local people, and even some interesting research on installing visual camera to observe the worm activities and problem in relation to PET latrine, the problem in relation to contaminating groundwater. If the groundwater table is close to the surface, that is the most common problem. And also you present quite nicely on how do we do with the waste from the emptying these pit toilets, like biogas development, this pyrolysis development of these pellets biochar out of it, and the health in relation to schistosomiasis, and a lot of things are dealt with the presentation. That was really very nice and interesting for me and for all participants, hopefully. With this, I will give for participants the opportunity to ask questions or comment on the issues. You can raise your hands in the system, or
I think Patrick Shaw has his hand up.
yeah, okay. Okay, continue, Patrick.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm from Zambia. I'm Patrick Shaw. I work for the Wildlife and Environmental Conservation Society of Zambia. Yeah. One interesting thing that I got from the presentation, and Prof, that was a brilliant presentation. Very helpful. I hope other countries would actually look at it. I'm looking at it at the angle of developing countries, those that are not yet with the systems in the ground and are still using the pit latrines, like the way you have actually shared. My take home, and which I wanted to find out from you, is on the worms. Are these breeded worms, or are these that as just introduced to the pit latrines? Because I don't think you really shared on that. And being from the background of ecosystem, it's a brilliant idea, because then if that is properly followed, it could reduce a lot of hazardous than to leave things move out. So I thought I could really look at that and hear from your side, Prof. Thank you very much for the good presentation.
Thank you, Patrick, for your question. So yeah, with the tiger toilets, you have to put the worm population into the toilet at the beginning when it's installed. We did a lot of research to figure out what mass of worms you need for how many users are going to use the toilet. So it's important to get that number of worms right. But you can use local worms. They don't have to be worms from the UK or anything. Lots of people, as I said, have installed these in 11 different countries now at least, and they're all using local worms. They're not worms from the UK. But yeah, you would need to seed the latrine with the sufficient worm population to start. But some of these toilets in India, where we've been working the longest, have been going now for 8 or 9 years without having to add new worms to the latrines. So once the population starts, it's a self-sustaining population. Worms are incredibly robust and adaptable creatures. And I was quite skeptical actually when the research started, because you know, I thought maybe the worms would die after a while, or they might leave the latrine. But I've been really pleasantly surprised that you know, as long as the latrine continues to be used, that you don't really need to adjust the worm population after the initial installation. The only other time you would have to put worms back into the latrine would be once you eventually have to empty the latrine. But as I showed from sort of the fill rate data, that probably would be after a much longer number of years than if it was a pit latrine. So maybe after, you know, 15 years as opposed to 5 years, for example, you would have to do that. And the other thing to say about that is that even when the tiger toilet does fill up eventually, it's mostly full with compost material from the worms. So that's very sterile, it's very safe, there's very low pathogen content in it. So the tiger toilet will fill up eventually, and you do have to then empty it, but it's a much safer process to do that at that point. So I hope that answers the question. And yeah, I'd encourage you, if you're interested in doing this in Zambia, to go to the webpage that I included in the presentation, because we now have a very international association, and people are very open to share their designs and their experience and operational experience with the toilets.
Okay, one of the question that comes through the chat box is that how about using human waste for fertilizer in the form of compost, for example?
Yeah, I mean, people have been composting waste for a long time, and there are established guidelines and protocols for doing that safely. I mean, obviously you have to ensure that there's been enough treatment time and storage time of the waste to make sure that the pathogens in the waste have died off. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that can be done as long as it's done safely. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me ask also my question as well. The pyrolysis process, this using high energy consumption for pyros, that means from 400 to 600 degrees centigrade without oxygen, is like to produce biochar or a kind of pellets biochar out of it. How it is feasible to use this energy to generate some kind of energy out of it, or to produce? Have you done some kind of experiment? Because we had tried this kind of experiment here at UI, here in NMBU, in Norwegian University of Life Science before, and then there is a risk of this feasibility. And the other thing is like, what about the health risk of toxic gas release when we are also burning this one? Just can you answer all these things?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So one thing about the energy is that you can actually recover the heat from the process itself. So once the process is started up, that can actually help to improve the energy efficiency of the process by using the heat that's generated by the pyrolysis process. But you're right that to make it energy efficient, really, when it comes to treating latrine waste, it comes down to the water content, really. So you have to find some way to dry the waste in an energy efficient way before it goes into the pyrolysis system. Otherwise, too much of the heat gets used up with the water component of the sludge, and you would have to heat it up for far too much for it to be energy efficient. But you can, you probably know that if you've done experiments like this before, depending on the temperature and also the length of the time that you treat the waste, you can generate bio oil or biogas in addition to biochar, or you can actually favor the production of those over the biochar. And you are right that there is a certain amount of gas that's produced, and I know that it's a process that is now being used. I know in India it's being used at scale to treat latrine waste, and it's something that they're quite interested in. Is how do we maybe capture or filter out that gas that's produced through the pyrolysis system. But I think I'm confident that it's an engineering challenge that can be solved. It's not a deal breaker from that standpoint. And from a theoretical standpoint, I think there are some energy benefits to doing this. I think the biggest benefit of pyrolysis, though, is also the space issue that I mentioned. You know, the fact that digestion takes several hours, you need quite a big digester, whereas pyrolysis happens in, you know, over the course of a few minutes, and you can do it at a much smaller scale. So I think for especially for urban sanitation solutions in the future, pyrolysis might have more and more applications.
Okay, thank you. With one of the question that comes through this chat box is, how is technology help us in improving fecal management system with less water? And at the same time, just answer the next one, how we manage heavy metal problems in waste. Just you can ask this, you can answer these two questions together.
So the first one I think was around how to use less water, really?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways, actually. I mean, I'll go back to the container-based sanitation example. So this is, you know, this new approach that's being used in a lot of places where instead of digging a pit, you have a container, and quite often the container has a urine diversion toilet, so it collects the feces separately from the urine. And quite often those are waterless toilets also. So, you know, the whole idea about using a container for your toilet is that it should be light, and it should be something that allows you to recover the resources in a sort of pure format, as opposed to being mixed with water. So I think there are ways that we can have dry sanitation technologies, and it especially makes sense if you're going with a service model like container-based sanitation. Heavy metals are definitely a challenge, and it's something that I think does require more research. It's not something we've looked at from the standpoint of some of the technologies I talked about, like the Tiger toilet. We haven't looked at heavy metals in the compost, for example, that's produced. It is, I think, something that needs to be considered carefully if you're looking at agricultural use of the sludge. Although, again, it's an area that's been fairly well studied, I think, in terms of there are already guidelines and limits in terms of heavy metals for application of biosolids for agricultural use. And so I think it's a challenge, but I don't think it's a deal breaker from that standpoint. Yeah,
one of the question also, how these waterless toilets can be integrated with the technology, like if you mention some kind of technologies that will be integrated with this.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, well, I think I explained it already for container-based sanitation, but I mean, for the Tiger toilets, though, we found that they do also work with dry toilets. That was something we were a bit interested in, was what's the minimum amount of water that's required for the worms to survive. And they do require a little bit of liquid, but I think it's something that can also be applied in dry situations. So yeah, but I think that's it's a good question. That's another area for research in sanitation, is clever new designs for, especially for water scarce areas where you don't want to waste water down your toilet.
Yes, and okay, one of the last question here also. So it's interesting to know how to overcome the challenge of its usability in the arid area, like this technology. I don't know.
So I think yeah, similar to the earlier questions around water. So I guess it's understandable for audience members in Ethiopia to ask about arid situations. And I guess I would go back to the container-based sanitation example. I mean, there are toilet designs which are dry toilets, and I would agree with what the audience members are suggesting, which is that really in water scarce areas, you should be trying to select dry toilet designs. I mean, pit latrines don't require flushing. So you know, there are methods out there for arid regions, I would say. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. There is no question actually after this or not. And thank you for your nice presentation and for this answering all these questions. I'll invite Dr. Felleka to finalize this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Templeton, and also Dr. Fessel for moderating this session. We had more than 60 participants from all over the world, Europe, USA, and also seeing prominent researchers in the area of water and sanitation participating in this webinar. So the purpose of this webinar is just to share experience and the best practices, and also to create a platform for future collaboration in the most challenging area of water and sanitation. So in Africa, particularly here also in Ethiopia. So thank you very much for joining us. Our webinar next month will be on mapping water security risks using isotopic tracers in Addis Ababa, which is somehow linked with our last month's webinar by Professor Nancy Love from Michigan University. So thank you very much. Again, please join us next month. Thank you very much. So see you next month. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Feleke. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.